Scientists are warning about the degradation of healthy soils across the world, estimating 40% has already been damaged through agriculture, deforestation and the overuse of chemicals. A new global think tank says 90% of the planet's soils could be degraded by 2050 unless urgent action is taken.
They buried piles of sheep wool under dry, dead soil right in the heart of Australia. No fertilizer, no watering, no chemicals. Just raw wool straight from the shearing sheds, tossed into the ground like it was trash. Locals thought it was a joke. Even on podcasts, people laughed it off, calling it a wild idea that wouldn't go anywhere. But then something started shifting. Quietly, slowly, and no one saw it coming. It wasn't a new product. It wasn't some fancy lab breakthrough, but it changed everything folks thought they knew about fixing damaged land. Let's start from the beginning. Land degradation. Out in rural Australia, huge areas have turned into lifeless, dusty plains. Some of these places once had healthy grasslands. Now they're cracked, dry, and nearly impossible to fix with standard methods. One of the main reasons for this damage? Overgrazing, mostly from sheep. The wool industry is still a big part of Australia's economy, but in some parts of the country, the environmental cost is hard to ignore. For decades, large sheep stations in areas like New South Wales, South Australia, and Western Australia have worn down the land. Sheep don't just nibble the grass, they often yank it up by the roots, which stops it from growing back. Their hooves pack the soil down, making it harder for water to soak in when it rains. Instead of absorbing water, the ground forms a hard crust, so rain just slides off, carrying away the top layer of soil. Without plants to hold the soil in place, wind and water erosion strip away the fertile layer on top. And once that's gone, native grasses and crops have a tough time coming back. In some places, more than 4 inches of topsoil have been lost over the past 20 years. That turns what used to be good farmland into dry, lifeless ground. This has become a major challenge for families who rely on that land to raise sheep. Many of them have been working these farms for generations. They've watched the land go from green and productive to dry and empty in just a few years. Reports from both the government and independent AG groups show that in some regions, over 60% of pasture land now shows clear signs of moderate to severe damage. Another part of the problem is monoculture grazing. In lots of areas, farmers grow only one kind of grass, usually types without deep roots. So when that grass gets eaten down or dies, there's nothing left to hold the soil together. That leaves bare dirt that struggles to recover. One big issue that shows up often is water runoff. Since the soil is compacted and can't soak up water well, rain just skims across the top, dragging nutrients and organic matter with it. In serious cases, it carves deep channels in the land and washes out entire patches of pasture. Farmers and scientists have tried different fixes. Some used mulch, others planted cover crops, spread compost, or added fertilizers. These can help in some cases, but they're costly, don't last long, or are hard to roll out over huge areas. And the problem is huge. Australia has over 160 million acres of sheep grazing land. That means even a small fix has to work on a massive scale. Any solution that needs constant upkeep, fancy machines, or lots of water doesn't really help folks living in remote, dry areas. Meanwhile, global demand for wool hasn't gone down. In fact, pressure to keep up with production is rising. That means some farmers are pushing their land even harder, especially during drought years. That makes recovery even tougher. Experts from several soil research centers have warned that without big changes, large parts of Australia could end up as permanent desert. And this isn't just about farming. Whole ecosystems could collapse, native plants and animals would disappear, and rural economies could take a major hit. Faced with millions of acres of dry, dying land and a wool industry under pressure, some farmers and researchers decided to try something new. They saw how much land was damaged, but they also noticed they had something else in huge supply: wool. And that's when things began to shift. Why wool might actually help. People usually think of sheep wool as something for clothes, but its natural structure makes it useful for more than just textiles. What many don't realize is that wool has special traits that can actually help improve soil if it's used the right way. Unlike synthetic materials, wool is made from keratin, a protein full of nitrogen, sulfur, and carbon, all elements plants need to grow. When wool breaks down in soil, it doesn't just rot away. It slowly releases nutrients over time. According to independent lab tests, raw wool can take 4 to 6 months to fully decompose in the ground, depending on moisture and temperature. That slow breakdown acts like a natural, long-lasting fertilizer. Unlike chemical fertilizers that can wash out during heavy rain, wool stays put and keeps feeding the soil gradually. Another key feature of wool is its ability to hold water. Wool fibers can soak up about 30% of their own weight in moisture without even feeling wet. This has been proven in industrial settings and helps explain why wool clothing works so well in both hot and cold weather. But underground, this same trait becomes even more valuable. It keeps moisture in the soil. In dry areas, that's a game changer. Buried wool catches and stores water during rain, holding it close to seeds and roots so they can survive longer between rainfalls. Wool also helps fix the soil's structure. As it breaks down underground, the fibers leave behind little pockets and channels that improve airflow and drainage. That makes the ground less compact and easier to work. Farmers who've tried using wool, either as mulch or mixed into the soil, say the earth becomes softer and more manageable once the wool decomposes. And better soil structure helps microbes thrive, which is a key sign of healthy land. In recent years, some organic farmers in dry parts of Australia started testing wool not just on the surface, but as something they could bury directly into the ground. One group working with sheep farms in Victoria started laying down low-grade wool, stuff too coarse or dirty to sell, in shallow trenches across worn-out pasture. Farm records show they were adding about 2 to 3 tons of wool per acre. It sounds like a lot, but this was mostly leftover waste that would have been burned or thrown away otherwise. There's no official standard for this method yet, but early feedback from those trials has been surprisingly positive. The buried wool didn't attract pests, didn't give off any bad smells, and didn't get in the way of plant growth. Instead, it quietly broke down over time, feeding the soil and keeping the root zone moist. Environmental engineers who reviewed the results say wool works in 2 ways, both chemically and biologically. As the wool decomposes, it boosts microbial life in the soil, and more microbes mean better nutrient cycling and increased organic matter, which attracts worms and insects. Those creatures tunnel through the soil, helping it stay healthy and loose. What's more, the wool doesn't need to be cleaned or treated. It can be raw, unwashed, and even covered in lanolin. In fact, that natural lanolin oil from the sheep's skin has mild antifungal properties that may actually help root systems during early growth. Some producers have started turning wool into small pellets to make it easier to handle. These wool pellets still hold water and carry the same nutrients, but they're much simpler to spread, especially for smaller farms or rough terrain. The real shift happened when farmers stopped thinking of wool as just waste. They began seeing it as a real tool for healing their land. It wasn't about squeezing more out of the earth. It was about using what they already had, right there on the farm, to bring it back to life. Preparing for the experiment. In early 2022, a small team of Australian landowners and soil researchers set out to test wool in a new way. Not as surface mulch or compost, but as a buried soil amendment for large-scale land recovery. This wasn't a lab project. They were working directly on overgrazed, compacted sheep pasture, soil so dry and worn out it hadn't supported real plant growth in years. The trial started on a 1,200-acre sheep station in western Victoria. The property had been hit hard by decades of grazing and erosion. Some fields had stopped growing grass completely, and the topsoil was patchy and thin. Leading the project was farm manager Michael Jennings. He had access to a huge supply of low-grade wool, fibers too short, coarse, or dirty to sell. He teamed up with agricultural advisor Emma Crawford, who had been researching soil repair in dry areas. Instead of laying the wool on top of the soil, they chose to bury it in trenches. The idea was to place raw wool into shallow furrows and cover it with soil. This would keep it from blowing away and hold in moisture to help it break down. The team set up 10 test plots, each 1 acre in size. Trenches were dug with basic farm equipment, about 12 inches deep and 3 feet apart. Wool was loaded into each trench by hand and with small bucket loaders, then covered back up. Nothing was cleaned or processed. The wool came straight from the shearing sheds, greasy, dirty, full of lanolin, burrs, and even bits of manure. Each plot received about 2 tons of wool per acre. That's roughly 4,000 pounds of raw wool buried into each section. They also left 1 plot untouched as a control. No trenches, no wool, just the same dry, compacted dirt they'd been battling for years. To keep the results clean, they didn't use any fertilizers or commercial soil treatments. Emma and her small team collected soil samples before trenching began. They measured nitrogen, moisture retention, soil hardness, and microbial life. The results were clear. The soil was low in nutrients, compacted, and nearly dead. The trenching and wool application took about 6 full days to complete. Timing was key. They aimed to finish just before the region's short rainy season kicked in. Michael hoped the rain would soak into the ground and help start breaking down the wool. After the trenches were filled, no seeds were added. The goal was to find out if the native grass seeds already in the soil could sprout on their own once the soil improved. Emma believed this was the clearest way to see whether wool alone, without any outside help, could bring life back to the land. Some local farmers weren't convinced. A few thought the wool would create a barrier underground and block roots from growing. Others were worried it would attract pests or just rot into a useless mess. One neighbor even warned it might all end up being a soggy waste of time. But Michael wasn't too concerned. From his perspective, the land was already useless. The worst-case outcome was nothing changing at all. Over the next few weeks, Emma kept tracking everything. Rainfall came in small, steady bursts. Water gathered in a few low spots, then slowly soaked in. Within 10 days, the soil above the trenches stayed darker and more damp than the rest, a sign that the wool might be holding water beneath the surface. Nothing was growing at first, but by the 3rd week, a few blades of grass began popping up along the trench lines. Michael didn't get excited right away. He'd seen quick false growth before, patches that dried up as soon as the moisture disappeared. But Emma noticed something different. The soil over the trenches was a bit cooler than the surrounding areas, which could mean root activity underground. They weren't in a rush. They knew the wool needed time to break down. The plan was to wait at least 10 to 16 weeks before expecting any major results above ground. Still, something felt different early on: the texture of the soil, the way it held water, even the smell. It didn't seem like dead land anymore. Now the wool was buried, the control plots were untouched, and all outside inputs were removed. It was a clean, honest test. What no one expected was how this simple act, burying waste wool in dry soil, would lead to results that would change how people talk about land recovery. What happened next? They had buried tons of sheep wool under dead, lifeless soil. But what came next shocked everyone. 7 weeks after the trenches were filled, something started happening across the test plots. From far away, it looked like a faint green haze across the fields, barely noticeable, but definitely there. In areas where nothing had grown for years, native grasses were starting to come back. No one planted them, no one watered them. The only change was the buried wool. Michael Jennings walked the test plots every morning and evening. At first, he thought it was just a few weeds, or maybe leftover seeds from the last season waking up. But by the 9th week, the green patches weren't just holding, they were spreading. The grass was thicker, stronger, and growing fastest right above the trench lines. Emma Crawford had been monitoring the soil closely. Around that same time, the lab data started shifting. Nitrogen levels in the trench plots had nearly doubled compared to the original samples. Sulfur was rising too. Both of these nutrients are found in wool, and the timeline matched perfectly with the wool starting to break down. Meanwhile, the control plots, where no wool was buried, stayed barren. Nothing had changed there at all. The difference was clear as day. In the treated plots, not only was grass coming back, but small native wildflowers were popping up too. It wasn't full coverage, but it was enough to make a noticeable contrast. Where the wool had been buried, the land was showing real signs of life. And when they tested the soil again, the results backed it up. Microbial activity had jumped. The number of bacteria and fungi in the soil kept climbing, a sign that the wool was breaking down and feeding life underground. By week 12, they found something even more surprising: worms. They hadn't been seen in that area for years, but now they were turning up in soil cores from the wool plots. One curious farmer who came by to see the results said it was the first time he'd ever seen land come back to life without seeds or fertilizers. Another, who'd spent over 10 years trying to fix degraded land, said that if this was real, it could save him tens of thousands of dollars in failed restoration efforts. By the end of the third month, even satellite imagery started picking it up. The test fields showed more plant growth than the land around them. Biomass readings were higher, which meant more vegetation was taking hold and staying there. The recovery wasn't just visible, it was measurable. Michael described the wool as a slow-moving underground sponge. During rainstorms, it soaked up water, held onto it, and then slowly released it back into the soil where roots needed it. That moisture stuck around longer than expected, even during dry spells. The new plants didn't wither the way they normally would, because the soil wasn't drying out so fast. What shocked people most was the idea that wool, the very byproduct of the sheep that had helped wear down the land, might actually be what brings it back. No chemicals, no fancy systems, just greasy, discarded wool, buried about a foot deep. Emma called it a kind of slow-release compost, but with an edge. The wool didn't just feed the soil, it improved its texture, held water, and brought back microbial life, all on its own. Word started getting around. Some researchers asked to visit the site. A few government reps reportedly came by quietly. There were no big announcements, but the results were hard to ignore. What they'd done, burying waste wool in dead soil, was working, and not just a little. The changes were real, visible, and far beyond what anyone had expected. Now the big questions were starting to surface. Could this method work on other types of land? Could it be used in other regions? And what would happen if they tried it on a much larger scale? No one had those answers yet, but one thing was obvious. The land was waking up, and it was wool, something most producers had long tossed aside, that was making it happen. Ecological and industry impact. Once it became clear that the test plots were recovering, the focus started to shift. What began as a quiet trial on one sheep station in Victoria was now catching attention from across the industry. Farmers, agronomists, and even environmental groups were starting to take notice. Some of the early findings spread casually through local farming groups. Others were shared through behind-the-scenes emails between agricultural advisors and state officials. No one had released anything official, but people were talking. Emma Crawford started getting questions from other properties. Folks wanted to know how much wool to use per acre, what kind of wool worked best, and how deep it needed to go. She made it clear that their trial used raw, untreated wool, not the clean, processed stuff. It had to be buried about 12 inches deep, laid out in a trench pattern that let air flow between each line. Just throwing wool on top of the soil wouldn't work the same. It needed to be buried to hold moisture and break down properly. Soon, environmental scientists in South Australia began trying the method in even drier areas, places where grass hadn't grown well in nearly 10 years. Early updates from those pilots showed mixed results depending on soil type, but one thing was consistent: water stayed in the ground longer. Even without big jumps in nutrients, that extra moisture gave grass and shrub seeds a better shot at surviving. The wool industry didn't change overnight, but small shifts started happening. Some wool processors, usually focused on high-end fiber, began exploring ways to use waste wool, belly wool, heavily contaminated fleece, and scraps that were usually burned or tossed. One processor, according to reports shared inside the Wool Innovation Network, began compressing waste wool into small pellets. These were about the size of corn kernels, easy to handle, and ready to be spread over large areas using basic farm tools. Once buried, they held their shape and soaked up water like full-sized wool. Michael Jennings didn't switch to pellets, but he stayed in touch with other farmers through online forums, sharing what had worked. He said the biggest hurdle was still logistics. Gathering, moving, and burying all that wool took time and basic gear. But the upside? He didn't need to spend on fertilizers or new irrigation. For wool producers, the material was already sitting there on the farm. Others saw opportunity. A few ag startups launched services to collect unsellable wool and deliver it to farms with degraded land. Some even pitched partnerships with government programs aimed at restoring farmland. Their goal was to help scale the method and bring it to more regions. On the ground, the changes were visible within a few months. Fields treated with wool saw less surface erosion. Rain no longer carved deep ruts through the dirt. The returning grasses, even if patchy, helped hold the topsoil in place. Insects returned too. Farmers started spotting ants, beetles, and even small birds coming back to fields that had been silent for years. It wasn't a full return to natural habitat, but it was enough to upgrade the soil status from degraded to transitional, based on local soil science assessments. But the most surprising benefit had to do with temperature. Readings taken during the hottest parts of the day showed that soil above the wool trenches stayed cooler than the untreated ground. That cooler soil meant less evaporation and better conditions for young roots to grow. It caught the attention of a few climate adaptation researchers, not just for farming, but for carbon storage. If wool helped soil retain moisture and store carbon better, it might have value beyond just pasture repair. Quiet conversations began, nothing public yet, about whether wool could play a small role in climate resilience through land-based solutions. Meanwhile, several wool industry groups started quietly watching the progress. No one had made an official announcement, but internal meetings showed growing interest in backing further trials. For an industry long affected by price swings and changing demand, this new use, soil restoration, could bring value to wool types that had always been seen as worthless. In the end, the real shift wasn't just in the land, it was in how people saw wool. It wasn't just something to sell, it was something to bury. And in doing so, it became part of healing the very soil that had been pushed to its limits. That change, though still in its early days, had already started making waves in both environmental and farming communities. If this story gave you hope, or made you think differently about farming, land, or even wool, give it a like, share it with someone, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-world stories just like this. Thanks for watching.